It all started with a case of mistaken identity. Officer Daniels and Officer McCall had just finished a long shift when a radio alert went out, suspect seen exiting a silver SUV near 5th and Maple, matching description of the armed robbery suspect. They turned the corner and saw a man in a dark blazer, carrying a briefcase, walking toward the courthouse. He looked calm, even professional. But the briefcase, the timing, and his general appearance checked just enough boxes for them to act. "Sir. Hands where we can see them." Before he could explain, the officers had already closed in. He didn't resist. Not because he was guilty, but because he was stunned. He was handcuffed, read his rights, and placed in the back of the squad car. "I think we got the guy," Daniels said. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't hear him speak. They just assumed. What they didn't realize was that the man they just arrested wasn't heading to court as a suspect. He was heading there to run it. Down at the precinct, things got even stranger. The man sat silently in the holding cell, his blazer neatly folded beside him, shoes still polished, expression calm, but unreadable. Officer McCall peeked through the bars. "You're quiet for someone who's about to be arraigned." The man looked up. "I was supposed to be in a courtroom 2 hours ago." McCall smirked. Yeah. Everyone's got somewhere to be." But something about the man's presence was off. He didn't plead. He didn't shout. He just waited. Meanwhile, upstairs, the shift supervisor began reviewing the arrest paperwork. "Wait," she said, brow furrowing. "You arrested Julian Cross." Daniels leaned against the doorframe. "Yeah. Matched the description. Wasn't cooperating." The supervisor blinked. "Julian Cross is the new circuit judge. He was sworn in last month." Silence. Then came a string of words that Officer Daniels would never forget: "Get him out of that cell. Now." The moment the supervisor's voice rang through the hallway, everything changed. Officer McCall dropped his coffee, and Daniels turned pale. "You're joking," he muttered. "No, I'm not," the supervisor snapped. "You just handcuffed a sitting judge. A federal appointee. And you didn't even ask for his ID." Daniels stammered. "He matched the description. We thought he was." "You thought wrong." Downstairs, the holding cell clanked open as 2 senior officers rushed in. "Judge Cross, we deeply apologize," one of them said, voice tense. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. You're free to go." Julian Cross stood slowly, brushing off his slacks. "I know my rights. I also know protocol." Neither were followed. He walked out with quiet composure, retrieving his blazer and briefcase. No yelling. No dramatics. Just the icy calm of a man who knew the storm was only delayed, not avoided. McCall and Daniels stood there, awkwardly silent. The man they thought they could push around had just become the one person they now had to answer to, officially. The silence was broken only when Judge Cross turned to them at the exit. "Gentlemen. I'll see you again," he said evenly, before stepping into the elevator. "Think he meant, court?" McCall whispered. Daniels didn't answer. He just stared at the closing elevator doors, heart sinking. 3 days later, the courtroom buzzed with activity. It was a high-profile case, department misconduct, wrongful detainment, and a formal review into officer accountability. The press filled the benches. Reporters typed furiously. The police department's PR rep sat rigid in the front row. Officer Daniels and Officer McCall sat at the defense table in full uniform, fidgeting nervously. Neither had slept much. Since the arrest, the story had leaked, though names had been withheld. The description of what happened was enough for rumors to erupt across the entire city. But nothing compared to the moment the bailiff stood tall and announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Julian Cross." Every head turned. In walked the man they had once cuffed. Only this time, he wore the robe. The gavel was his. And every eye in the room followed him as he moved with the calm command of someone who owned the space. Daniel's mouth went dry. McCall avoided eye contact completely. Judge Cross took his seat at the bench and scanned the courtroom with deliberate patience. Then his gaze landed on the two officers. A flicker of recognition passed through his eyes, but no smile. No scowl. Just something colder than anger, professional detachment. "I have reviewed the case," Judge Cross began, his voice calm but firm, "and I find multiple procedural violations, ranging from detainment without probable cause to failure in confirming identity." The officers shifted uncomfortably. "But beyond the paperwork, this case is about accountability," he continued. "It's about what happens when assumptions replace procedure, and when power is used without responsibility." He leaned forward slightly. "And unfortunately for some," he said, eyes locking with Daniels, "that lesson must sometimes be learned, from the other side of the bench." A quiet gasp rippled through the crowd. For Daniels and McCall, this wasn't just a disciplinary hearing anymore. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The courtroom sat in weighted silence as Judge Cross flipped through a thick case file in front of him. Daniels clenched his jaw. McCall wiped his palms on his pants under the table. They hadn't just made a mistake, they'd humiliated someone with the power to reshape their entire careers. Their department's attorney, Ms. Teller, stood and tried to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor, while the incident was regrettable, the officers were responding to an active bolo alert. The individual matched the description provided by dispatch, Ms. Teller," Judge Cross interrupted, his tone measured but sharp. "Does matching a vague description of dark blazer, medium build, briefcase justify detaining a man less than 20 feet from a courthouse, without so much as requesting identification?" Teller hesitated. "It was fast-moving, not fast enough to prevent a complete violation of constitutional rights," he said, setting the file down. "This wasn't a case of urgency. It was a case of assumption over verification. And when officers skip steps, people pay the price." He paused. "Sometimes that person is a bystander. Sometimes a public servant. And sometimes, a judge." The words hung in the air like a blade. Daniels could feel his face flush, but not with anger, with shame. Then Judge Cross did something unexpected. He stood. Leaving the bench, he walked down the steps slowly, coming to a stop directly in front of the defense table. His robe shifted gently as he moved, but his posture never wavered. "I didn't call this hearing for revenge," he said, now addressing the entire room. "This isn't about personal pride. This is about the culture in law enforcement that permits shortcuts, protects carelessness, and endangers public trust." He turned to McCall. "Officer McCall, do you remember what I said before I was placed in the squad car?" McCall swallowed. You said you were supposed to be in court." Cross nodded. "And what was your response?" McCall looked down. "I said, everyone's got somewhere to be." Judge Cross paused. "Exactly. Everyone does have somewhere to be. But your job is to make sure they get there without being stripped of their dignity." He turned back to the bench and climbed the steps again. "This court recommends an internal review of both officers' conduct, mandatory retraining, and temporary suspension pending departmental judgment. And it advises this department, and others watching, to remember, authority is not immunity." The gavel slammed once, echoing like thunder. Adjourned. Daniels and McCall sat frozen. Not because of the ruling, but because they had just been judged by the very man they tried to ignore. And he had done it with precision, not vengeance. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning. The media had caught wind of the story days earlier, but now they had confirmation. Judge Julian Cross had presided over a misconduct hearing involving his own wrongful arrest. And the way he handled it? Calm. Controlled. Devastating. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps as Daniels and McCall exited the building in silence, flanked by their union rep, Officer Daniels. Any comment on today's ruling? Do you regret what happened? Were you aware he was a judge when you arrested him? Do you believe this will end your careers? Neither officer answered. They kept walking, eyes low, faces tight. At the top of the steps, Judge Cross appeared. He stood tall, composed, arms at his sides as he surveyed the crowd. The noise instantly hushed. All cameras turned to him. "I will only say this," he began. "What happened to me was not unique. Every day, someone is treated as less than who they are, because someone else didn't stop to ask the right question, or follow the right step. In my case, I had the privilege of clearing my name, publicly." He looked out over the sea of microphones. But not everyone has a courtroom to walk back into. Not everyone has a robe to put on when it's over. That line hit hard. He turned to go back inside but paused. Let this be a reminder, not just to officers, but to all of us. Titles don't make you important. Actions do. He disappeared behind the courthouse doors, leaving silence in his wake. Inside, the court clerk approached him. "Judge Cross, are you sure you want to stay on this case?" Julian gave a small smile. "I think I just finished the most important case of my career." And with that, he stepped into his chambers, no longer just a judge, but a symbol of restraint, justice, and quiet power. Weeks passed. The incident became a national talking point. Cable news shows debated it, legal podcasts dissected it, and civil rights panels held discussions centered around Judge Cross's actions. The video of him calmly presiding over the officers who arrested him had gone viral. But he didn't speak further to the media. No interviews. No statements. He let the courtroom speak for itself. Meanwhile, inside the department, the consequences were unfolding like dominoes. Daniels had been placed on administrative leave. McCall was reassigned to desk duty. Their reputations within the department took a hit, not just because of the arrest, but because of how they handled it afterward. Officers who once nodded at them in the hallway now avoided eye contact. Daniels sat in the internal affairs waiting room, reviewing the report he was preparing for his appeal. It detailed the timeline, the decision-making, and what he now admitted were several key failures in judgment. But the words felt hollow. Because deep down, he knew the truth, it wasn't about bad luck. It wasn't just a misread. It was a mindset. A quiet, creeping habit of seeing people as suspects first, and humans second. He'd spent years justifying it. Fast decisions save lives, he used to say. You hesitate, you get hurt. But after seeing the look in Judge Cross's eyes, that calm disappointment, that total control, it cracked something deeper than pride. It cracked his certainty. Across town, Judge Cross sat at his desk, reviewing a new stack of cases. One in particular caught his eye, an excessive force complaint filed by a delivery driver against two beat cops who never turned on their body cams. He read it carefully. No shortcuts. No assumptions. His clerk entered the room. "Sir, a visitor's here. Says you saw him in court, the day of the Daniels hearing." Cross looked up, puzzled. "Send him in." A man walked in, hesitant but determined. It was McCall. "Judge Cross. I know I probably shouldn't be here. I'm not looking for favors. I just needed to say something." Cross closed his file and leaned back. "I spent the last few weeks rewatching that hearing. Reading about you. Thinking about how fast I dismissed someone I knew nothing about. And it wasn't just you. I realized, I've done it before. Maybe not as extreme, maybe not as visible. But I've cut corners. I've judged people. And I needed you to hear it from me." A long pause. "I was wrong." Cross didn't speak right away. He studied McCall, reading not just his words, but his posture, his tone, his intent. Finally, he nodded. "You made a mistake," he said. "But owning it, that's rare." McCall exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding it in for weeks. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he added. "I just wanted to say it. Out loud." Cross stood, walked over, and extended his hand. "I can't change the system overnight. But people like you deciding to do better. That's how it starts." They shook hands, firmly. No cameras. No court reporters. Just a quiet moment between two men on opposite sides of a mistake, and now, maybe, on the same side of something better. Months later, the story of Julian Cross had taken on a life of its own, not as a scandal, but as a turning point. The city had launched a new judicial police initiative named CROSS, short for Community Review of Standard Systems, inspired by the judge's calm handling of the high-profile arrest and hearing. The program paired junior officers with judicial advisors for training workshops on due process, civil rights, and public trust. Judge Cross was reluctant to attach his name at first. "I don't need a brand," he told the mayor bluntly. "I need results." But in the end, he agreed, on one condition. "I'll help lead it, but only if the first two officers to go through the program are Daniels and McCall." There was silence on the other end of the table. "You want them to stay?" the mayor asked. "I want them to learn," Cross replied. "Punishment without growth is just paperwork. But if they face what they did, and grow from it, that sends a message stronger than any suspension ever could." And so they did. Daniels, at first, was resistant. Defensive. Even combative in the early sessions. But one workshop changed everything. It featured a man named Robert Ellis, a teacher who had been wrongfully detained while picking up groceries after work. No charges, no apology. Just a traumatic experience he couldn't forget. "I was humiliated," Ellis said, voice steady. "In front of my students, no less. They saw me in cuffs before they saw me in class." Daniels looked down at the floor. He remembered the look on Judge Cross's face that day, the mix of disappointment and dignity. And now, hearing Ellis speak, it clicked. He stood up at the end of the session and said, "We need to do better. I need to do better. Because none of this means anything if I don't carry it back out onto the street." The room clapped. Even McCall patted his shoulder. Later that week, Judge Cross visited one of the training sessions unannounced. He watched from the back as Daniels led a discussion about probable cause, identification protocols, and the emotional weight of detainment. Daniels didn't know he was there. But Cross didn't need recognition. He just listened. And when the session ended, he quietly left, with a small, rare smile crossing his face. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. And in this rare case, it had worked. Back at the courthouse, Cross placed a simple frame on his bookshelf. Inside it was a folded copy of the original police report, with one word written in red across the top, reversed. Not for vanity. Not as a trophy. But as a reminder of what the system could do, when it chooses accountability over ego, and integrity over impulse. Nearly a year had passed since the day Judge Julian Cross walked into court as both victim and authority. The city had changed. Small things at first, like officers greeting civilians instead of staring past them. Police briefings that now included not just tactical planning, but accountability discussions. Judges inviting patrol units into mock hearings to understand legal thresholds from the bench's perspective. And behind so much of that quiet evolution was one man, Cross. He never made it about himself. No speeches, no book deals, no viral crusades. Just deliberate action, measured words, and a deep belief that the system had to be better, because he had seen it fail from the inside. One cool autumn morning, Judge Cross received a letter. The envelope was hand-addressed. No return name. Just a street in the very precinct where Daniels and McCall had once worked. Inside was a single-page letter, typed, neat. Your Honor, I don't know if this is the right thing to do, but I needed to write it. Since the hearing, I've thought about that day 100 times. How I should have stopped. How I should have listened. But what stayed with me more than anything, is how you didn't retaliate. You could have embarrassed us publicly. You could have demanded we be fired. Instead, you made us learn. You gave us a chance. And that changed me more than I thought it could. I want you to know, this morning, I stopped a rookie from making the same mistake. He was about to detain a man who looked like someone from an old call sheet. I stepped in. I asked questions. I made sure we didn't just assume. That man walked away free. Not because of me, but because of you. You didn't just judge us. You challenged us. And I hope, wherever you are today, you know you made us better. With respect, Officer McCall Cross read the letter twice. Then he folded it gently and placed it in the same frame that once held the original arrest report. He replaced the document, but left the red word, reversed, still showing in the corner. Later that week, in a closed-door judicial conference, Cross spoke to a room full of judges. Justice isn't about titles, he said. It's about truth. And sometimes, truth comes from the people we least expect, when we give them the chance to rise above their worst day. One judge raised a hand. Do you believe real reform is possible? Cross paused. Not everywhere. Not overnight. But I believe in the people who have to wear the consequences of failure. And if we listen to them, instead of punishing in silence, he looked out the window at the courthouse steps, the same place he once stood in cuffs. Then yes. Reform doesn't just happen. It begins. 1 year to the day after the arrest, the courthouse held a quiet ceremony, no media, no fanfare. Just judges, officers, and community leaders gathered for the official launch of the Cross Initiative's citywide expansion. Julian Cross arrived late on purpose. He didn't want applause. He didn't want cameras. But when he entered the hall, the room naturally stood. Out of respect. Out of acknowledgement. Not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. The mayor approached the podium. Today, we honor not just a program, but the principle behind it. That mistakes, when met with courage, can lead to real change. She looked at Cross. Judge Julian Cross reminded this city that dignity, patience, and restraint aren't signs of weakness, they're the bedrock of real power. The audience applauded, but Cross didn't take the mic. Instead, he motioned to the back, where two familiar faces stood, Daniels and McCall. The crowd turned. Nervously, the two officers stepped forward. Their uniforms were crisp, their posture straighter, their expressions resolute. I didn't come here to talk, Cross finally said. I came to show you what accountability looks like, after the mistake. He nodded to McCall, who now took the stage. A year ago, I was part of a moment that could have ended my career, McCall said. But instead, it became the start of something I didn't know I needed, humility. He glanced at Judge Cross. This man didn't cancel me. He confronted me. And then, he helped me rebuild. Daniels followed next, voice less polished, but raw. We thought we were protecting the public. But we weren't even protecting the law. Judge Cross showed us what that actually means, not with punishment, but with purpose. The room erupted in applause. But this time, it wasn't just for the judge, it was for the transformation. Later, as people mingled, Cross stepped outside, finding a moment of quiet beneath the courthouse columns. A reporter, young, probably fresh out of college, approached cautiously. Sir. Just one question. Why didn't you sue them? Or demand harsher punishment? Cross looked out across the city skyline. Because justice isn't a hammer, he said. It's a scale. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do, is let people tip it back into balance themselves. The reporter paused. And if they don't? Then, Cross said softly, you bring them back to court, and show them how. He walked down the steps alone, his robe flowing gently behind him. Not as a man who won. But as a man who chose something greater than revenge. He chose change. Months later, Judge Julian Cross sat alone in his chambers after hours, the courthouse quiet, city lights flickering beyond his window. The framed letter from McCall still sat on the shelf behind him, beside the faded police report that started it all. He picked up a pen and began writing in a leather-bound journal, something he hadn't done since law school. Power tests everyone differently. Some are tested by how they use it. Others by how they lose it. But the rare few are tested by how they forgive. He closed the book, exhaled, and stood. On his way out, he passed a bulletin board in the hallway now titled Community Reform Spotlights. Dozens of photos were pinned to it, officers in training seminars, judges sitting with high school students, ex-defendants who'd returned as guest speakers. At the center was a photo from the Cross Initiative launch. It showed Judge Cross flanked by Daniels and McCall, not as enemies. Not even just as colleagues. But as representatives of what the system could become. As he reached the doors of the courthouse, a janitor pushing a cart gave him a nod. Evening, Judge. Cross smiled. Evening. The city wasn't perfect. The system had cracks. But for once, it felt like someone had done more than just talk about fixing them. He stepped into the night air, letting the heavy courthouse doors shut behind him. And with that, Julian Cross disappeared into the city, quietly, humbly, having changed it forever.